It is with a profound sense of privilege and an almost mystical reverence that I examine the trajectory of Paul Klee, a master whose work resonates not merely as a milestone in the history of modern art, but as an invisible treatise on the genesis of form and the birth of chromaticism in the artist's consciousness. In undertaking to rewrite his story with informational density and a more erudite tone, I feel compelled to begin this reflection exactly where Klee began his creative adventure, at the absolute beginning of graphic expression, at the point. This is not a studio anecdote or superficial witticism, but the most succinct and paradoxically most comprehensive definition of the aesthetic adventure itself. A line is a point that went for a walk. This apparently simple maxim encapsulates the philosophy of a Swiss visionary, born on December 18, 1879, in Münchenbuchsee, on the outskirts of Bern. Klee's birth context is crucial to understanding the foundation of his visual syntax. He was born into a house where music was not merely a pastime or secondary activity, it was the mother tongue, the primary language that would forever shape his perception of the world. His father, Hans Wilhelm Klee, German by birth and a singing teacher at the State Seminary in Hofwil near Bern, brought with him not only the Germanic musical tradition, but also the German citizenship that Paul would inherit, an apparently bureaucratic detail that would have dramatic consequences decades later. His mother, Ida Marie Frick, was a talented pianist who had studied at the Stuttgart Conservatory. This immersive environment, this daily score, paved the way for what many predicted would be his inevitable destiny: musical virtuosity. The Klee household reverberated with scales, arias, and sonatas from the early morning hours until dusk. Young Paul grew up immersed in an atmosphere where every object seemed to vibrate at specific musical frequencies, where silence was merely a pause between sonic movements. At age 7, he began violin lessons with Carl Jahn, and demonstrated from early on an exceptional talent that suggested a promising career as a concert performer. Indeed, Klee was no mere amateur. At 11 years of age, he was already performing with orchestral ensembles in Bern, serving as an extraordinary violinist in the Bern Musical Society. His technique was impeccable, his interpretation sensitive and mature for his age. However, while he tuned his bow and dedicated himself to the rigorous discipline demanded by classical music, he cultivated a parallel existence, a secret life that manifested itself in the intervals between rehearsals and in the margins of musical scores. This life expressed itself in notebooks filled with drawings, where the discipline of the violin gave way to the insubordination of the line. These were fiercely ironic caricatures, satirizing teachers and the Swiss bourgeoisie, populated by unreal creatures and faces whose deformation suggested that paper possessed an almost biological elasticity. These early drawings revealed a sharp, observant spirit, capable of capturing not only physical appearance, but the psychological essence of his models, distorting it through a filter of mordant humor and social criticism. The dialectical tension between the mathematical order of music and the inherent risk of drawing shaped Klee's adolescent identity crisis. To be a violin virtuoso, following the safe and respectable path of classical music, or an unfettered painter, navigating the uncertain waters of visual creation. This decision was not made lightly. For years, he oscillated between the two vocations, aware that each choice implied significant renunciations. Music offered structure, social recognition, and an established tradition. Painting promised freedom, but also uncertainty and marginality. He chose the latter, opting for the risk and autonomy of visual creation, a decision that would mark not only his life, but the course of modern art. In 1898, at 19 years of age, he went to Munich to begin his formal training in the visual arts. Munich was, at the turn of the century, one of Europe's cultural epicenters, rivaling Paris in its artistic effervescence. The city pulsed with new ideas, nascent artistic movements, and an atmosphere of experimentation that attracted young artists from across the continent. Klee initially passed through the private studio of Heinrich Kneer, where he perfected his basic technical skills in drawing and composition. Subsequently, after rigorous entrance examinations, he entered the prestigious Akademie der Bildenden Künste under the tutelage of Franz von Stuck, known as the Prince of Painters, for his technical mastery and dramatic symbolist style. It is notable and historically significant that von Stuck was the same professor who would come to instruct Wassily Kandinsky, indicating a point of academic convergence between two of the greatest architects of modern abstraction. Under von Stuck's guidance, Klee learned the traditional techniques of academic painting, the meticulous study of anatomy, rigorous perspective construction, mastery of chiaroscuro, and classical composition. However, Klee, although he mastered academic drawing with a precision that would later be described as surgical, quickly found himself bored by rigid academicism and its established conventions. His creative compass was shifting, and this transformation was meticulously recorded in his notebooks, which functioned as laboratories of ideas where he experimented not only with visual forms, but with philosophical concepts about the nature of art. The aphorism that marks this conceptual inflection is one of the pillars of his aesthetic theory. Art does not reproduce the visible, rather, it makes visible. This revolutionary statement, recorded in his diaries around 1900, represents a fundamental break with centuries of mimetic tradition in Western art. This statement is an invitation to philosophy, more than a simple artistic declaration, and deserves detailed scrutiny to understand its revolutionary depth. If art must make visible that which is inherently invisible, the inner rhythm of objects, the fundamental structure of the universe, pure thought, the forces that shape reality, then mere mimetic reproduction of nature becomes not only a fruitless task, but a fundamentally misguided one. It is a fascinating paradox that reveals the complexity of Klee's thought. While he theorized about the need to transcend the visible, he drew with the control of a surgeon, mastering the line with almost insulting precision. The line was simultaneously his tool of metaphysical investigation and aesthetic insubordination, evidence of his musical discipline transposed to paper, where each stroke carried the same intentionality as a note in a musical score. Despite his incontestable mastery in handling the line, Klee harbored a profound distrust of color, a limitation he recognized with painful self-awareness. For years, he described himself with relentless self-criticism as a painter without color, a confession that revealed not only humility, but an acute perception of his own artistic limitations. His preferred media during this initial period were India ink, monochromatic wash, the austere binary of black and white that allowed him to explore tonal nuances without confronting chromatic complexity. Between 1903 and 1905, this preference for the negative, for pure line over chromatic effusion, culminated in his first recognized series of masterpieces, the series of etchings titled Inventions. These small engravings, executed with impressive technical mastery, were as fierce as they were intimate in their vision. In them we find fragile acrobats balancing on invisible wires, melancholic masks that seem to contemplate existential void, and cutting social satires that exposed the hypocrisies of bourgeois society. There Klee was already in his initial plenitude, the caustic humor that stripped pretensions bare, the poetry of the minimal gesture that suggested universes, and the intellectual mordacity that transformed each image into a philosophical reflection. The intellectual and spiritual journey that would lead him to overcome this chromatic aversion was paved by a crucial trip undertaken between October 1901 and May 1902, when he visited Italy on an artistic pilgrimage that was almost obligatory for young artists of the time. He passed through Milan, Genoa, Pisa, Rome, Florence, Naples, and Pompeii, absorbing not only Renaissance and classical art, but also Mediterranean light, ancient architecture, and Italian cultural atmosphere itself. Klee did not return from this pilgrimage with the conventional ambition to emulate the great Renaissance masters, as was the academic practice that dictated servile copying of Michelangelo or Raphael. Instead, he returned with a fundamental suspicion, confirmed and amplified: art's potential to compose rhythmic structures, silent and varied, just like music, but operating in the visual domain. Moreover, he confirmed art's capacity to think, to philosophize through forms and colors, to communicate ideas that transcend verbal language. His diaries from this period are filled with penetrating aphorisms, marginal notes that seem like fragments of an invisible philosophical treatise on the nature of artistic creation. The question that became his central obsession began to refine itself with crystalline clarity. How to convert time, the melodic duration of music, into the palpable and visual space of painting. Klee's personal life and aesthetic investigation became organically intertwined in an indissoluble manner. In 1906, after a long engagement, he married the Bavarian pianist Lili Stumpf, whom he had met years earlier during his studies in Munich. Lili was not merely a loving companion, but an intellectual interlocutor who deeply understood Klee's artistic ambitions. Like his mother, Lili was a talented pianist, and her presence brought an additional dimension of musicality to the artist's home. They initially settled in Munich, creating a domestic environment that was simultaneously a creative laboratory and an informal musical salon. In 1907, their only child Felix Paul Klee was born, who would later become an important theatre director. The Klee household was literally a daily score in constant execution, filled with piano lessons that Lili taught to support the family, violin studies that Paul continued to practice religiously, and on the improvised studio table, papers where lines began their silent dance. Klee lived in tight financial conditions, with sporadic sales and many doubts about his future as an artist. The couple depended primarily on Lili's income as a piano teacher, a situation that reversed the traditional gender roles of the time and allowed Klee to dedicate himself entirely to his artistic research. This scenario of material difficulty, common to great innovators who choose unconventional paths, did not prevent him from maintaining an incessant and methodical investigation. He learned new techniques with encyclopedic veracity, tested diverse supports, paper, fabric, wood, metal, experimented with unconventional materials, and noted his discoveries as if they were rhythmic measures toward a harmony not yet achieved but sensed. His studio was a space of constant experimentation, where each failure was documented with the same rigor as successes, transforming the creative process into a form of scientific research applied to art. Around 1911, Klee began interacting with the revolutionary circle of Der Blaue Reiter, the Blue Rider, an artistic movement that brought together some of the most innovative minds of the European avant-garde: Wassily Kandinsky, Franz Marc, August Macke, Gabriele Münter, and Alexei von Jawlensky. It is essential to note that Klee did not join them as a dazzled student or neophyte seeking guidance. He arrived as a mature and sophisticated interlocutor with whom they shared the same fundamental metaphysical interrogations: the search for the spiritual in art, the autonomy of form in relation to representative content, and the fascinating phenomenon of synesthesia, the neurologically documented capacity to see sounds or hear colors. His participation in the group culminated in the historic second Der Blaue Reiter exhibition in 1912 at the Hans Goltz Gallery in Munich, where he presented 17 works that demonstrated his artistic evolution and his search for his own visual language. This exhibition marked his definitive entry into the European avant-garde circuit and established connections that would be fundamental to his later development. The year 1912 was also marked by his transformative trip to Paris in April, where Klee's musical line finally found the chromatic lightning that was missing to complete his artistic language. Paris was then the incontestable epicenter of artistic modernity, where Cubism, Fauvism, and other revolutionary currents coexisted and confronted each other. In Paris, through the mediation of his friend Wilhelm Ude, he discovered Robert Delaunay and the Orphism movement, a lyrical variant of Cubism that privileged color and rhythm over geometric fragmentation. Delaunay's works, particularly his Windows series, presented what Klee would describe as windows of color that do not illustrate but vibrate with their own life. These abstract compositions, where color functioned as a structural element and not merely decorative, revealed to Klee possibilities he had intuited but had not been able to realize. He also had contact with the works of the Cubists in Picasso and Braque's studio, absorbing their lessons about the deconstruction of form, but always maintaining a critical distance that would allow him to develop his own path. Klee, the master of linear structure and transposed musical composition, perceived with meridian clarity that his line, precise and already dominant, needed sooner or later to ignite with color to achieve its full expression. He confessed in his diary, with the brutal honesty that characterized him, the fundamental gap that persisted in his art. He masterfully controlled form, but had not yet been born to color. The absolute turning point, The seismic event that divided his artistic life into two distinct periods and retroactively resignified all his previous production occurred in April 1914 with the legendary trip to Tunisia. This expedition, undertaken in the company of Auguste Macke and Louis Moeliet, lasted only 2 weeks, but its impact would reverberate throughout the history of modern art. In Tunis, Carthage, Hammamet, and especially in Kairouan, the ancient sacred city of Islam, Klee experienced a quality of light that completely transcended his European experience. It was not simply a more intense or brilliant light. It was a light that seemed to possess its own substance, that did not merely illuminate objects but transformed them into pure chromatic vibration. The whitewashed walls of Arab houses were not white, but contained the entire chromatic spectrum in potential. Shadows were not absence of light, but colored presences that dialogued with illuminated surfaces. It was on this North African soil, in this unprecedented chromatic baptism, that he recorded in his diary on April 16, 1914, the phrase that would seal his definitive conversion and give him the title of painter, no longer hesitant but absolute. Color possesses me. I don't need to pursue it anymore. It will possess me forever, I know. This is the meaning of this happy hour. Color and I are one. I am a painter. This chromatic epiphany, the birth of the complete artist through Tunisian light, was the catalyst that fused all his previous investigative elements into a powerful and original synthesis. The structural musicality inherited from his training, the obedient and simultaneously rebellious line he had mastered through years of practice, the acid humor that stripped pretensions bare, and the precision of the etcher who knew how to extract the maximum from each stroke. The point that, in its inaugural definition, had gone for a walk, finally found the promised land, the territory where it could consummate its journey, the infinite and vibrant domain of color. Kairouan at dusk became a mystical vision, the white walls that tinged with violet and orange, the minarets that seemed like pure geometry cut against a sky that transitioned through all shades from blue to red. The narrow streets where shadow did not bring darkness but colored, tinted, transformed each surface into a potential canvas. The Arab market with its fabrics, spices and ceramics offered a chromatic symphony that surpassed any European palette. The shock of North African light and visual culture was, for Klee, more than an aesthetic discovery. It was a complete artistic resurrection. The watercolors and drawings that emerged from this journey are immediate and vibrant testimonies of this fundamental transmutation. Works like Red and White Domes, View of Kairouan, and Garden in Saint-Germain present houses reduced to pure patches of color floating in space, landscapes that dissolve into vibrant geometries where the distinction between object and atmosphere dissolves. These papers, many executed in situ under the scorching desert sun, became talismans, sacred relics of his artistic conversion. The watercolor technique, with its transparency and fluidity, allowed Klee to capture the ephemeral and luminous quality of the Tunisian experience, creating works that seemed to breathe light. However, the return to Germany was abrupt and brutal, tragically coinciding with the outbreak of World War I in August 1914. It is a painful and ironically significant contrast that marks the divergent fate of his travel companions. Auguste Macke, his companion in the Tunisian color epiphany, would die in combat just 5 months later, in September 1914, in the first weeks of the conflict at age 27. Franz Marc, another central member of Der Blaue Reiter, would fall at Verdun in 1916. Klee, for his part, due to his German citizenship inherited from his father, was conscripted only in March 1916, when the war had already decimated a generation of young Europeans. Thanks to a fortuitous combination of his influential connections, his relatively advanced age, 36 years, and his admittedly fragile health, he was spared the horrors of the front line. Instead, he was assigned to the rear guard, working initially at the aviation school in Schleißheim, where he was responsible for maintaining records, and later in camouflage painting workshops in Gersthofen. The irony of this situation is glaring and worthy of deep sociological analysis. The man who had just discovered the metaphysical and vital power of color in Tunisia, who had declared his mystical union with chromaticism, was obliged to apply it with the diametrically opposite objective: to hide, dissimulate, make war machines invisible. This experience of using art for military purposes, of subjugating creativity to the purposes of destruction, deeply marked Klee. In letters to his family, especially to Lily, he combined mordant irony and philosophical detachment, stating with black humor that he was safer painting airplanes in the rear guard than he had ever been in any academy, while Europe burned in conflict and his artist friends fell on the battlefields. Paradoxically, while the European continent consumed itself in the unprecedented carnage of industrial war, Klee became incredibly prolific in his artistic production. Between 1916 and 1918, the darkest years of the conflict, he produced more than 500 works, an eloquent testimony that artistic creation can not only survive, but flourish in forced isolation and methodical investigation. The military environment, with its rigid but predictable routine, offered Klee a structure within which he could work with almost monastic regularity. These were delicate watercolors executed on repurposed military paper, elaborate drawings in the margins of official documents, and audacious experiments that fused archaic symbols, calligraphic signs, and chromatic patches in an entirely new visual language. His paintings from this period began to present a unique iconographic vocabulary, boats sailing on abstract seas that suggested both physical crossing and spiritual journey, faces that metamorphosed into tribal masks, questioning the nature of identity, and fish floating in aquatic spaces that completely defied conventional three-dimensional logic. His paintings no longer dedicated themselves to describing objects from the external world with photographic fidelity. They transformed into complex interior maps, cartographies of the human psyche, and the creative process itself. Each work functioned as an autonomous microcosm, governed by its own physical and visual laws. Formal and institutional recognition did not take long to arrive after the armistice. In 1919, his first major solo exhibition occurred at Hans Goltz's prestigious gallery in Munich, presenting 362 works covering a decade of production. Specialized critics quickly realized they were facing a fundamentally unclassifiable artist who had created an entirely unique visual language. He did not fit comfortably into the consolidated categories of the avant-garde. He was not an orthodox cubist like Picasso or Braque, nor a typical expressionist like the members of Die Brücke, and he did not align with Italian futurism or emerging Russian constructivism. He was simply and complexly Klee, an autonomous artistic universe. The critic Will Groman, who would become his principal biographer and interpreter, described him with lapidary precision, defining him as a modern classic, an apparent oxymoron that perfectly captured his unique ability to synthesize the instinctive naivety of a child with the accumulated wisdom of a medieval alchemist and the intellectual rigor of a contemporary philosopher. In 1920, Klee was invited by Walter Gropius to join the faculty of the Bauhaus, the revolutionary school of art, design, and architecture founded in Weimar the previous year. The Bauhaus represented an ambitious attempt to reconcile art and industry, craftsmanship and mass production, creating a new synthesis suitable for the 20th century. Klee began teaching effectively in January 1921, remaining at the institution until 1931, first in Weimar, 1921-1925, and then in Dessau, 1925-1931. This period represents not only the consolidation of his revolutionary pedagogical method, but also the development of some of his most significant and influential works. His classes at the Bauhaus were light years away from traditional academic recipes. They were true mental journeys, scripts for phenomenological exploration of form and color. Klee developed a unique curriculum that combined theory and practice, philosophy and technique, intuition and systematic analysis. He dissected the line as a point in temporal movement, analyzed the plane as a linear walk that had been interrupted and crystallized, and conceptualized color as an organic force that breathes and pulses with its own life. His lectures, meticulously prepared and illustrated with complex diagrams, explored themes such as the nature of nature, paths of natural study, and theory of pictorial configuration. His students did not leave classes with ready-made models to copy, but with notebooks filled with enigmatic diagrams and paradoxical phrases that seemed like Zen koans or fragments of Hermetic poems. Due to the esoteric depth of his theories and perhaps with a touch of affectionate humor, he was nicknamed by students the Mystical Paul, or the Bauhaus Magician. Klee's obsession with systematization and the compulsive need to methodize his creative search led him to create, from 1911, a rigorous and unique cataloging system. He numbered each of his works with scientific precision, using the year of creation, a sequential number, and coded abbreviations indicating the technique employed. The system was not mere pedantic bureaucracy or obsessive organization, but the conversion of artistic investigation into a readable scientific method, the creation of a visual laboratory with a complete index. This methodical rigor, which might seem antithetical to spontaneous creative impulse, is actually a demonstration of his musical heritage, where discipline and structure are prerequisites for true expressive freedom. At the Bauhaus, he shared physical space and constant intellectual dialogue with Wassily Kandinsky, who had joined the school in 1922. It is fascinating and revealing to observe the relationship between these two giants of modern art, who maintained adjacent studios and neighboring houses in the Masters Complex in Dessau. They were, as well described in specialized literature, complementary opposites who balanced each other. Kandinsky sought the spiritual in abstraction with an almost religious and messianic solemnity. Klee approached the same territory with penetrating irony and subtle humor. The Russian painted visual symphonies of color that aspired to the Wagnerian sublime, while the Swiss drew visual chamber quartets and delicate conceptual sarcasms. However, despite their radically different temperamental approaches, both converged on the essential, the unshakable conviction that art is an autonomous language that must be constantly invented and reinvented, not merely copied or reproduced from external models. The Bauhaus years were extraordinarily fruitful in works that became indisputable icons of artistic modernity. Consider Twittering Machine, 1922, that surreal contraption of mechanical birds that seem to sing on an electric line, a work that combines black humor with subtle criticism of the mechanization of modern life. The work simultaneously suggests the poetry of birdsong and the horror of their transformation into automatons, questioning the price of technological progress. Or consider Senecio, 1922, a face geometrically fragmented into planes of warm color that is simultaneously a childlike mask in its simplicity and an ancient face in its implicit wisdom, capturing the complete cycle of human existence in a single image. The work demonstrates Klee's unique ability to condense philosophical complexity into apparently simple forms. And certainly we cannot fail to mention Angelus Novus, 1920, a small mixed-media work on paper that took on a life of its own and transcended its original context. Acquired by Walter Benjamin in 1921 for 1,000 marks, this enigmatic image of an angel with wide eyes and open wings carried with it a fascinating parallel biography. For Benjamin, it became the visual incarnation of his philosophy of history, the angel of history of his theses, inexorably propelled toward the future while contemplating, horrified and powerless, the accumulated ruins of the past. The work survived Benjamin himself, who died fleeing the Nazis in 1940 and became an icon of 20th century critical thought. During this period at the Bauhaus, Klee also developed his theories about movement in static art, exploring how to create the illusion of temporality on a fixed two-dimensional surface. Works like Highway and Byways, 1929, demonstrate this concern, with their lines that seem to pulse and vibrate, creating paths that the eye must travel temporally. He was essentially trying to solve the fundamental paradox of how to incorporate the temporal dimension of music into the instantaneous spatiality of painting. However, the relative calm and freedom of experimentation at the Bauhaus were brutally interrupted by the inexorable rise of Nazism in Germany. The political winds that had been blowing since the late 1920s became a totalitarian hurricane in the early 1930s. In 1931, anticipating the difficulties to come, Klee left the Bauhaus and accepted a position at the Dusseldorf Academy. But even this strategic move was not enough to protect him from what was to come. On January 30th, 1933, with Adolf Hitler's rise to power as Chancellor of Germany, the fate of Klee and the entire German artistic avant-garde was sealed. In April of the same year, he was summarily dismissed from his position and officially labeled as a degenerate artist entartete Kunst, a term the Nazis applied to any form of art that did not conform to their retrograde aesthetic ideals and racial ideology. The Gestapo raided his house in Düsseldorf, searching his belongings for evidence of subversion. His works were systematically removed from German museums, with more than 100 pieces confiscated from public collections, many of which would later be destroyed or illegally sold to finance the regime. Klee returned to Bern with Lilly in December 1933, bearing the heavy label of exile in his own native landscape. The cruel irony of his situation did not go unnoticed. Although he had been born and raised near Bern, his citizenship was German, inherited from his German father, making him technically a foreigner in his country of origin. In the infamous Degenerate art exhibition of 1937 in Munich, organized by the Nazis to ridicule and demonize modern art, 17 of Klee's works were displayed as examples of what should be repudiated and eradicated from German culture. The works were accompanied by derogatory captions and insulting comparisons with drawings by psychiatric patients in a grotesque attempt to delegitimize his art. He brought from Germany few boxes of material belongings, but many papers, notebooks, and the unshakable conviction that true art does not bow to any political regime. The bureaucratic process of Swiss naturalization, which he requested immediately after his return, dragged on with Kafkaesque slowness, only being resolved on July 5, 1940, 6 days after his death, underlining to the end the existential precariousness of his situation in exile. While seeking to re-establish himself in Bern, looking for suitable house and studio, and trying to reconstitute the network of contacts and patrons that Nazism had cut at the root, Klee suffered a devastating biographical blow that could have permanently paralyzed any other creator. In the summer of 1935, after months of increasingly worrying symptoms, stiffness in the joints, difficulty swallowing, changes in skin texture, he received the definitive diagnosis of scleroderma, progressive systemic sclerosis, a rare and incurable autoimmune disease. This condition is particularly cruel for a visual artist. The skin progressively hardens, breathing becomes increasingly difficult, hand movements become slow and painful. The body transforms, in the poignant analogy of a doctor of the time, into badly stretched paper, tensioned and brittle from within. For months after the diagnosis, he could barely work, producing only 25 works in 1936, the lowest number since his youth. For most artists, this would have been the inevitable endpoint. For Klee, it became the threshold of a new and urgent visual language, a final creative flowering of unprecedented intensity. What emerges between 1937 and 1940, his last years of life, is essentially a complete second artistic life, an extraordinary proof of intimate and creative resistance. The works from this period grow dramatically in format, which contrasts powerfully with the artist's progressive physical fragility. The lines become thicker, more incisive, as if each stroke carried the existential weight of the moment. The signs acquire an almost telegraphic urgency, communicating with maximum economy of means. It is no longer about deciphering complex landscapes or constructing elaborate visual architectures. The paintings from this period seem like monumental scriptures, large slates or walls where primordial symbols speak directly, without mediation, point blank. The palette simplifies but gains in emotional intensity. The titles become more enigmatic and poetic, suggesting hidden narratives and personal mythologies. In 1939, despite the progressive disease that made each movement an act of heroic will, Klee completed the impressive number of 253 works, a volcanic year of production that defies any rational explanation. The titles of his last works are not merely descriptive. They are existential declarations, condensed philosophical testaments. We have Engel noch tastend, Angel Still Groping, 1939, part of his extraordinary series of late angels that seem like creatures in the process of formation, still learning the nature of their own existence. These angels are not the majestic figures of traditional Christian iconography, but hesitant beings, fragile, almost comic in their humanity. We have Insula Dulcamara, 1938, an imaginary island map where the world reduces to pure sign and symbol, a utopian refuge of imagination against the brutality of the real world. And more poignantly and cathartically, Tod und Feuer, Death and Fire, 1940, a visual calligraphy of bone and ember that simultaneously condenses the collective disaster of the approaching war and his titanic, intimate struggle against illness. The work presents a skull face that seems to contemplate its own dissolution with a mixture of terror and acceptance. In these final works, there is no trace of self-pity or victimism. There is, rather, a sober and penetrating irony, a crystalline lucidity that refuses to preach sermons or seek easy consolation. Disarticulated puppets, dancing skeletons, tribal masks, and invented alphabets manifest as if Klee were creating the fundamental writing of a future civilization, or perhaps decoding the hieroglyphs of a lost culture. This was his masterful response to the surrounding barbarism. Neither political propaganda pamphlets nor escapist flight into the decorative, but the open and polysemic symbol, the radical affirmation of complexity and nuance in times of brutal simplification and ideological shouting. Even the Switzerland that welcomed him was not a completely complacent or welcoming refuge. Part of the conservative public viewed him with xenophobic suspicion. Some provincial critics considered him too strange, hermetic, and international for traditional Swiss taste. But Klee, at this point in his life and career, no longer engaged in discussions about popular adhesion or critical rejection. He concentrated obsessively on adjusting techniques, refining his visual language to its purest essence. He used wash, tempera, diluted oil, pastel, and combined diverse supports with total experimental freedom. He experimented with collaged newspaper, dyed fabrics, and strokes that resembled archaic musical notations or cuneiform scripts. Each work was a unique, unrepeatable experiment, as if he were racing against time to explore all possibilities of visual creation before the body definitively gave way. If at the Bauhaus he had systematically taught that a point, a line, and a plane could generate a complete visual universe, now he practically demonstrated this theory, drawing entire universes with the minimum necessary elements: a stylized eye, a hypnotic spiral, an ambiguous sign that is simultaneously letter, path, and face. His studio in Bern, documented in photographs from 1939, was a chaotic archipelago of tables with works in different stages of completion, a true alchemical laboratory of visual creation. The body was increasingly fragile and limited, but the hand maintained surgical precision. The pulse remained steady when holding the brush. The formal economy he achieved in these last years was not a renunciation forced by illness, but the maximum concentration of expression. Each stroke carried the accumulated weight of his entire personal and artistic history, of the inexorable disease, of forced exile, and, despite everything, persistent humor, sometimes black and mordant, sometimes almost childlike in its purity. In May 1940, Klee traveled to Muralto Locarno, in the Italian-speaking Swiss canton of Ticino, hoping the milder climate would alleviate his increasingly severe symptoms. But the body, which he had tried to transcend through the discipline of artistic creation, finally gave way. Paul Klee died on June 29, 1940, in a clinic in Muralto at age 60, leaving a legacy of approximately 9,000 catalogued works and countless notebooks of theoretical annotations. The final and bitter irony lies in the fact that his Swiss naturalization was finally approved on July 5, 1940, 6 days after his death, denying him in life the official recognition of belonging to the country where he was born. His body was cremated, and the ashes buried in Schosshalden Cemetery in Bern. On the gravestone is engraved a phrase of his authorship that poetically summarizes his eternal search for the origin and essence of creation. Diesseitig bin ich gar nicht fassbar, denn ich wohne grad so gut bei den Toten wie bei den Ungeborenen, etwas näher dem Herzen der Schöpfung als üblich und noch lange nicht nahe genug. I cannot be grasped in the here and now, for I reside just as much with the dead as with the unborn, somewhat closer to the heart of creation than usual, and still not close enough. This last phase of his life, where visual grammar reached its maximum purification and the legacy crystallized, is where Klee's philosophy reaches its apex. Health progressively betrayed him, but his response was to redouble his creative pulse. He did not paint against scleroderma in a heroic battle, but rather through it, incorporating physical limitations as constituent elements of his new language. He altered work rhythms, experimented with larger formats when energy allowed, and radically simplified his visual syntax to achieve greater depth when breath was scarce. His discipline, the same that rigorous musical training had taught him from childhood, functioned as an immutable internal score. If the violin could no longer sound, the flute entered. If the body failed, the idea maintained the beat with metronomic precision. The immediate impact of his death was deeply felt in the artistic world, despite the limitations imposed by World War II. Lily Klee dedicated the rest of her life to preserving and promoting her husband's legacy, establishing the foundations for what would become the Zentrum Paul Klee in Bern, inaugurated in 2005, which houses the world's largest collection of his works. Felix Klee also played a crucial role in preserving and disseminating his father's work, organizing exhibitions and publications that kept the flame of his art alive during the dark decades of the post-war period. But Klee's true legacy transcends museums and collections. His influence permeated deeply through multiple generations of artists and continues to reverberate in contemporary art. Joan Miro absorbed and transformed the lesson that the sign can metamorphose into a living creature, developing his own vocabulary of biometric forms. Alexander Calder perceived through Klee that a line in three-dimensional space could dance and float in the air, leading to the invention of mobiles. Jean Dubuffet found in Klee validation for his search for art brut, raw art unmediated by academic training. Experimental musicians of the avant-garde, from John Cage to Morton Feldman, recognized in Klee a fellow traveler, someone who understood the deep listening of silence and the minimal, of the essential stripped of ornamentation. Their graphic scores echo Klee's visual experiments, where musical notation frees itself from the traditional staff. Graphic designers and typographers learned from Klee that a flat color, if strategically positioned, communicates more effectively than an entire catalogue of special effects. Architects discovered in his studies on balance and tension principles applicable to spatial construction. Psychologists and art therapists found in his work and methodology valuable tools for accessing the unconscious through visual creation. His belief in the line as a direct extension of thought and emotion founded therapeutic practices that use drawing as a form of expression and healing. Art educators at all levels, from kindergarten to university, inherited from Klee the fundamental pedagogical question that neither expires nor loses relevance: how to convert an aesthetic mystery into a didactic method without annihilating its poetic essence. Klee's theoretical legacy, condensed in his pedagogical writings such as the Pedagogical Sketchbook and The Thinking Eye, continues to be studied and reinterpreted. His ideas about the nature of the creative process, the relationship between consciousness and intuition, and the role of art in society remain surprisingly contemporary. His insistence that art must make visible, rather than merely reproduce the visible, anticipated decades of later art theory, and continues to influence contemporary conceptual artists. Klee's impact on contemporary visual culture is ubiquitous, even when not explicitly recognized. His influence can be detected in children's book illustration, where apparent simplicity hides conceptual complexity, in digital interface design, where economy of means and visual clarity are paramount, in urban art and graffiti, where symbols and signs create visual narratives in public space. Even in popular culture, echoes of his aesthetic appear in animations, video games, and fashion design. Klee's continued relevance in the 21st century lies partially in his interdisciplinary approach avant la lettre. In an era of increasing specialization, he demonstrated that the boundaries between music, painting, poetry, and philosophy are artificial and limiting. His artistic practice was essentially holistic, integrating multiple forms of knowledge and expression into a unique synthesis. This approach particularly resonates with contemporary artists working with new media and technologies, constantly crossing disciplinary boundaries. His working method, meticulously documented in his diaries and notebooks, offers a model of artistic practice as systematic investigation. In an era of artistic production often dominated by the market and spectacularization, Klee represents the integrity of the artist-researcher, committed to genuine exploration regardless of fashions or commercial pressures. His obsessive cataloging of works, far from being mere bureaucracy, reveals a commitment to art as a form of cumulative and evolutionary knowledge. The ethical dimension of Klee's work also maintains crucial relevance. His silent but determined resistance to Nazi totalitarianism, his refusal to explicitly politicize his art while maintaining a clearly humanist stance, offers a model of cultural resistance that transcends pamphleteering. In times of extreme polarization and simplification of public discourse, Klee reminds us of the subversive power of complexity, productive ambiguity, and humor as a form of resistance. If today, at any study table around the world, an apprentice draws a green sun or a geometrically impossible house, Klee smiles from his eternity. The conventional logic of the world is not, nor should it be, the police of color or form. If an adult, overcoming the ingrained fear of technical ineptitude, dares to draw without pretensions of virtuosity, Klee returns to the classroom as an inspiring presence. For apparent clumsiness is, in many revealing cases, the most direct and honest shortcut to the true, to authentic expression unmediated by sterile conventions. And if a contemporary creator finds themselves paralyzed before the intimidating void of the blank plane, stunned by the excessive and cacophonous eloquence of the hypermediatic world, Klee whispers through time his golden rule, the last and purest aphorism of the visual alchemist master. Less noise, more relation. This maxim, apparently simple, contains a complete aesthetic philosophy. Art is not about quantity or spectacle, but about meaningful connections, about revealing the hidden relationships between apparently disparate elements. Paul Klee did not leave us a dogmatic slogan or prescriptive manifesto, but something infinitely more valuable, a perpetual tuner of vision, a permanent invitation to visual discovery. His legacy is not a closed set of techniques or styles to be imitated, but a fundamental attitude toward creation, inexhaustible curiosity, rigor without rigidity, seriousness tempered with humor, and above all, the courage to follow the line wherever it wishes to walk. This is why his biography should not be closed as a concluded historical chapter, but permanently open and reinterpreted at each new moment of creation. Because each time a point decides to begin its inaugural movement, each time a line courageously goes for a walk through the unexplored territory of the plane, each time a color finds its just and necessary vibration, the history of art not only continues, but begins again, renewed and full of infinite possibilities. Paul Klee taught us that each creative gesture is simultaneously the end of one journey and the beginning of another, that each work is both epitaph and birth, that true art inhabits this liminal space between the dead and the unborn, always a little closer to the pulsing heart of creation, though never close enough to exhaust its fundamental mystery.